a pain that has been handed down to the next generations. We need to right those wrongs, heal together, and create a new future that honors the unique gifts of our children and grandchildren. How do we do this? Through sharing our personal stories, legends, and traditional teachings, we found that we are interconnected through the same mind and spirit. Our traditional teachings speak to acts such as holding one another up, walking together, balance, healing, and unity. Our stories show how these teachings can heal their pain and restore dignity. We discovered that in all of our cultural traditions, there are teachings about reconciliation, forgiveness, unity, healing, and balance. The elders provided us with this hopeful message because in their wisdom, they knew there would be difficult moments on the path to reconciliation, but that we would be able to continue that work as Canadians by drawing strength from one another. Today, we take one more step together by responding to Call to Action 17, which will allow residential school survivors and their families to reclaim their names on their passports and other travel documents, names that had been stolen from them by the residential schools. Our names are among the first things we receive. They're individualized, unique. They speak to our past, honoring those who came before us, and reflect our family's history. Naming children is a profoundly important tradition across many different cultures and communities. The traditional names given to Indigenous children carry deep cultural meaning. Yet for many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, colonialism has robbed them of these sacred names. Indigenous children, stolen from their families, to be forced into the residential school system, had even their very names stolen from them, as the testimonials of the survivors, which are contained in the TRC final report, lay out in painful detail. At the Aklavik Anglican School in the Northwest Territories, a young Inuit girl named Masek became Alice. She would not hear her original name until she returned home. At the Capel School in Saskatchewan, Pathmaker became Daniel Kennedy, and Adelard Standing Boileau was named for Adelard Langevin. Over the years, Indigenous peoples have courageously been reclaiming their names. At times, efforts to use traditional names have been met with everything from polite rejection to racist aggression. De nombreux autochtones se sont heurtés à des obstacles de la part des gouvernements, de la police, des écoles et d'autres institutions lorsqu'ils ont tenté de récupérer ces noms comme moyen d'exprimer leur identité autochtone. Il y a quelques années, la Commission de vérité et de réconciliation a mis en lumière cette question et nous ne pouvons pas l'ignorer. Avec la tragédie de Kamloops, les communautés autochtones ont été confrontées une fois de plus à l'héritage douloureux et durable du système des pensionnats. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Calls to Action number 17 called on all levels of government to enable residential school survivors and their families to reclaim their Indigenous names on identity documents. And today, I'm proud to announce that our government has implemented Call to Action number 17. Effective immediately, Indigenous individuals can now apply to reclaim their names as written on passports and other identity documents. While Call to Action 17 specifically referenced passports, as the Minister, we have gone further and are including replacement travel documents, including citizenship certificates and permanent resident cards. As well, it will apply not only to residential school survivors and their families, but to all Indigenous people in Canada, and it will be totally free. pour permettre aux personnes qui demandent la récupération des noms ancestraux de disposer d'un moyen clair d'effectuer ce changement important. Immigration, réfugiés et citoyenneté Canada rationalise ce processus de récupération afin qu'il soit rapide et efficace pour les demandeurs. As we make this important change, I want to take a moment to mention our progress towards fulfilling two more of the TRC's calls to action. Last Thursday, the Senate passed Bill C-8, amending Canada's Oath of Citizenship to reference First Nations, Inuit, and Métis rights and our obligations to uphold the treaties. This answers call to action number 94. And as I said at the time, the Oath of Citizenship is more than mere words. It's a public declaration of belonging. Now, new citizens will understand their role in reconciliation the moment they join the Canadian family. And in response to call to action number 93, my department is currently hard at work updating our citizenship guide to give newcomers a thorough and honest account of Canadian history, one that emphasizes the role and stories of Indigenous peoples, including those parts that relate to residential schools and more. And we look forward to sharing it with Canadians very shortly. Reconciliation requires all of us, including our newest Canadians. Je suis profondément honoré de me joindre aux ministres Bennett et Miller pour faire cette annonce aujourd'hui. Et maintenant, je vais passer la parole à la ministre Bennett. Merci.
Merci. Outlakot, Tansi, hello, bonjour. Je me joins à vous aujourd'hui du territoire traditionnel des Mississaugas of the Credit, où nous honorons tous les peuples autochtones qui ont pagayé ces eaux et dont les mocassins ont parcouru ces terres. La Commission de vérité et de réconciliation a révélé la vérité sur les pensionnats et une fois que l'on connaît la vérité, on ne peut pas l'oublier. Des générations d'enfants autochtones ont été victimes du système de pensionnat, ce qui a entraîné des conséquences tragiques qui se font encore sentir aujourd'hui. Il incombe à tous les Canadiens de veiller à ce que les préjudices subis dans les pensionnats ne soient jamais oubliés et que chacun emprunte le chemin de la réconciliation avec les peuples autochtones. This truth is important to tell and honor, and the pain is always there, as we have seen with the horrific news of the findings in the area of the Kamloops residential school. Our hearts are with the Kamloops, Sequepum First Nation, survivors, families, and Indigenous communities across Canada as they deal with the pain of this heartbreaking, devastating finding. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action are instruments for accountability, healing, and actions to guide the renewal of our relationship with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in Canada. But these calls to action do not and cannot erase the experiences and the tragedies that Indigenous peoples have faced for generations. That is why it's so important that we are here today to announce the implementation of Call to Action 17. Today, residential school survivors, their families, and all Indigenous peoples can reclaim their Indigenous names on documents, such as passports and other travel documents. It's an important step to support First Nations, Inuit, and Métis reconnect to their cultural identity that was taken from them by harmful government laws and policies. It is truly important step that their rightful traditional identity will once again be recognized. We are making progress, concrete progress, on implementing the 94 calls to action, but we know there's still much more work to do. Legislation to establish the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation has received royal assent. The act to amend the Oath of Citizenship has passed third reading in the Senate. And of course, the act respecting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is moving through the Senate. We know that healing and reconciliation is a long journey, and we are committed to continuing to take action to redress the legacy of residential schools and advance reconciliation across Canada. I thank my colleague, Minister Mendicino, for not only his beautiful explanation, but his profound understanding of the important step we're taking today, and thank colleagues across the whole of government and partners in all other jurisdictions for their part in this journey of reconciliation. Miigwech, Nakamik, merci, thank you, merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Minister Bennett. Kwekwe ulukut tanse. Hello et bonjour. I want to continue to express my deepest sorrow about the recent tragic findings from Kamloops. We are working with Kamloops to provide resources, and we will be there to support any Indigenous peoples who want help, in particular those who are currently undergoing searches. The findings in Kamloops are a stark and vivid reminder of the dark legacy of residential schools that persist today. And sadly, this is, again, only the tip of the iceberg. La Commission de vérité et de réconciliation a été créée pour documenter l'histoire des pensionnats et informer tous les Canadiens de ce qui est passé, y compris l'impact qu'ils ont eu sur les peuples autochtones et leurs familles. L'objectif de la Commission de vérité et de réconciliation était de guider et d'inspirer toutes les personnes au Canada dans un processus de réconciliation et de renouvellement des relations qui devaient être fondées sur la compréhension mutuelle et le respect. Dans le cadre de son rapport final, la Commission a lancé 94 appels à l'action pour réparer les séquelles des pensionnats et faire avancer ce processus. En tant que gouvernement, nous avons pris ces appels à l'action au sérieux. Je suis heureux d'être ici aujourd'hui avec le ministre Mendicino, ministre de l'Immigration et des Réfugiés et de la Citoyenneté, pour prendre part à cette annonce sur les mesures que nous prenons pour répondre à l'appel à l'action 17. Cet appel demande au gouvernement de permettre aux survivants et à leurs familles de récupérer leurs noms qui ont été changés de force par les politiques coloniales, en renonçant aux frais de changement de nom sur les passeports et autres documents officiels comme sur les cartes de statut, et ce pendant 5 ans. Et c'est exactement ce que nous faisons pour les documents fédéraux sur lesquels nous avons un contrôle direct. Le ministère du ministre Mendicino a simplifié et optimisé le processus de changement de nom sur des documents tels que les passeports, les documents de voyage et les certificats de citoyenneté. Le processus sera gratuit pendant 5 ans pour les survivants des pensionnats et tous les peuples autochtones du Canada. Il s'agit d'un exemple concret de notre gouvernement qui prend acte des appels à l'action, ainsi que notre approche pan-gouvernementale visant à établir une nouvelle relation avec les peuples autochtones. Answering call to action 17 is important as names are essential to our identity. They hold references to where we are from, our family's history, and our language. So it's my hope that the changes that we are making will make it easier for survivors of residential schools and all Indigenous peoples to reclaim their identity and truly express who they are and honor their families and culture. Miigwech, Nakumik, Marci, thank you et merci.
Thank you, ministers. We will now begin the press conference portion of the event. Merci, les ministres. En passant maintenant à la conférence de presse. So we'll now go to the phone. En passant maintenant au téléphone. Operateur.
Thank you, merci. Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 maintenant pour poser une question. The first question is from Chris Reynolds, the Canadian Press. Please go ahead.
Hi, ministers. Thanks very much for taking our questions. I'm curious about proof of Indigenous identity. To what extent that individuals will have to provide that in order to change their name on these or return their name to what it is on these documents? What requirements will be in place?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Chris, and it allows me to once again highlight the importance of call to action number 17, which, as I said in my introductory remarks, is very much about allowing Indigenous peoples to reclaim their names that were stolen from them during the course of the residential schools. Having looked at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, I was very moved by the testimonials of survivors who, as you heard in my remarks, had had their names stripped from them. Over the course of the coming days, but effective today, my department will be there to support Indigenous peoples who apply to have their names reclaimed on passports and other travel documents. We will work in partnership with them and with Indigenous leaders and communities across the country to ensure that this process is smooth. As I said, it will not only apply to those survivors of the residential schools, but others as well who may have had their names stripped from them. And the process will be entirely free. And we want to be sure that we are doing this in partnership with Indigenous peoples as a means of showing our commitment to reconciliation.
I can just add stuff.
Okay, thank you.
Just Chris, from the experience that we've had with status cards, particularly Indigenous Services Canada, we want to cut out all the red tape because it can be difficult, and this is about people reclaiming a very important part of their identity. So we know that obviously the easiest thing to do is to put up red tape, and that isn't the objective here today. It's to make it as easy and seamless as possible, just like we have done with status cards.
Okay, thank you. And then secondly, I'm wondering if the government has been able to have any talks with provinces about similar efforts at the provincial level for equally crucial documents such as healthcare cards or driver's licenses. Anything on that front?
What I can indicate is what I have seen is an effort to have dialogue between provincial governments and Indigenous leaders, but certainly will defer to those levels of government to update all as to the status of their implementation of Call to Action 17.
As you know, we have had a call for and have agreed to a First Minister's meeting on Indigenous issues, and obviously we are working together with all of our partners in all the jurisdictions to move forward, not only on the implementation of the calls to action, but also missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and really the larger picture of reconciliation.
Thank you. Passons maintenant à la prochaine question. On va go to the next question. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. The next question is from Olivia Stefanovic from CBC News. Please go ahead.
Good morning, ministers. I'm wondering if you can tell us what took so long to make this change. It's been 6 years since the TRC recommended this. Was there some sort of hurdle you had to overcome? And also, how many people would this affect?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Olivia. And I do agree that there is an absolute need to act to implement the calls to action. One of the themes that came across loud and clear in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report is the need to act with urgency. I will tell you that from the perspective of my department, that we have moved forward with, as you heard in my remarks, calls to action number 93 and 94. And I want to take a moment to thank my colleagues in the Senate as well as in the House for allowing us to make speedy progress on that legislation. And we look forward to seeing Bill C-8 receive royal assent so that we can begin to administer the new oath. And as I've explained on many occasions, citizenship ceremonies are quite profound, and it will be quite something to be able to share that experience with new citizens who will have a better understanding of our relationship with Indigenous peoples, and more importantly, their role, and collectively all of ours, in educating ourselves about the traditions, the histories, and the cultures of Indigenous peoples. And the same is true with regards to the citizenship guide. We are moving forward with as much speed as we can. We also want to make sure that we're having conversations with Indigenous leaders and other advocates in this space, one that will lead to a citizenship guide that truly and authentically reflects our history, including the difficult, dark chapters of it, like residential schools, but which remain a visceral part of our reality today. And finally, with regards to call to action number 17, I'm pleased that we're able to move forward with it. We have the support of my two colleagues, Ministers Bennett and Miller, and we will work, as I said, very closely with Indigenous peoples to make sure that the process of reclaiming their names that were stolen from them, is as seamless and efficient as possible.
And Olivia, if I could just add, congratulations to Minister Mendicino and his former colleague that at the ceremonies themselves now, we now will have the changed oath, but coast to coast to coast, elders have been invited to do the land acknowledgement, to be there, to explain to new Canadians the history of this country in whatever way they see fit, and that is going beyond the TRC calls to action, and that's what's so important now, that we are moving even in some areas beyond what was written down in the TRC calls to action.
Then Olivia, finally, you asked about numbers, but it could be hundreds of thousands of people. As you know, the approach to the Canadian passport with many communities is different. Some reject it as they reject Canadian identity. So this doesn't solve that issue. But what it does offer is people that choose to use the Canadian passport can now see their Indigenous name reflected in it, which is not only a symbolic issue, but a matter of profound identity. So we'll see, but it could be hundreds of thousands of people if you base the numbers on census numbers, quite simply. But we don't know. We'll see, and we'll work with people that choose this important symbolic and concrete action.
Follow up, Olivia?
Yes, thank you. To Ministers Bennett and Miller, the Chief of Six Nations wrote to you last Friday asking for $10 million from your $27 million fund to search the grounds of its former residential school, the Mohawk Institute. That's about a third of that $27 million fund. And I'm wondering, first of all, will this request from Chief Marc Hill, will this be accepted? Will they get the $10 million? And what does this tell you about how much more money is needed? Will you now have to get more money for this fund since there is so much demand?
Well, I think, Olivia, what we know is that every community is going to work on their priorities. Some are asking to start with money with a gathering, and some on commemoration, others for research, others for the kind of archaeological expertise. We will work with all communities coast to coast to coast, and we will be there for them and support their priorities as they do this difficult work.
Just for context, as you know, Olivia, that school in particular, if you can call it that, was one of the biggest in Canada in operation. So it will require significant work. Can't speak to the numbers. There have been preliminary searches done there in the past with some history to it, but we'll look at that and process it as they come in. We're getting a number of requests across the country, and we'll get a sense of things and process them in due course. I have a call in to Chief Hill to discuss this specifically, but it is something that isn't done easily, and as you know, with the ones where they have found evidence of remains, it is something that takes a whole heck of a lot of time and very, very delicate procedures, operations, and protocols. So we'll work with them and we'll be there for them. That's the assurance that we give to every community that's taking this difficult decision to move forward.
Thank you, Olivia. Merci, Olivia. En passant maintenant aux prochaines questions. We'll now go to the next question. Operator, operateur.
Thank you, merci. The next question, and the last one, is from Kirsty Kirkup, the Globe and Mail. Please go ahead, your line is open.
Good morning. I wanted to start off by asking Minister Mendicino if you could please, you talked about the timeline working towards the new citizenship guide and the need to get this done quickly but carefully. What is the projected timeline? Is it early in the new year? What are you looking at?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Kirsty, and you're quite right. We are moving forward with updating our citizenship guide. We'd like to be able to launch it as soon as we can. And one of the themes that came across in my interaction with parliamentary colleagues in both the House and the Senate was a desire to see that citizenship guide updated as close in proximity to the coming into effect as the new citizenship, because they are very much consistent with the calls to action that were laid out by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in as much as the need to educate not only new citizens, but all Canadians about our relationship with Indigenous peoples. And certainly it is my commitment to achieve that goal. We do have to get it right, though, and I do want to underline that my department is making efforts to continue to reach out and engage with Indigenous leaders to ensure that we are able to receive, their perspectives, and to make sure that the guide, captures the diversity of histories and traditions and cultures. It is an important exercise. That too came through in my conversations with Indigenous leaders. And I recall also speaking about it with Senator Sinclair before he retired from the Senate. And I want to thank him, as well as Senator Anderson, for being the sponsors of Bill C-8. We would not have been able to get to this point without them. And we look forward to having an update soon with regards to the citizenship guide.
Christy, if I could just add that I also think that we are working in collaboration with Adrian Clarkson's Institute for Canadian Citizenship. This is a very strong priority of their government to have new Canadians educated and then adopt their responsibility for reconciliation. And I just wanted this opportunity to say, how grateful we are for their hard work.
Follow-up, Christy?
Yes, and just on another matter, ministers, I know that Minister Miller took quite a few questions on this last week, but today, of course, there will be proceedings happening in federal court all week with respect to the judicial review on the two orders from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. I'm wondering, just to explain to Canadians, how is this approach, seeking a judicial review, in step with reconciliation?
Thanks. It's an important question, and I think Canadians do need answers. I think what is important to note is that this government has said, Prime Minister Trudeau has said time and time again, that every First Nation child that has suffered discrimination at the hands of a broken child welfare system in Canada will be fairly, justly, and equitably compensated. There have been proceedings in the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal that have done some groundbreaking work to achieve substantive equality for Indigenous children that up to now have not had a fair shake and have been treated in atrocious manners. We have made immense progress since 2016. When it comes to compensating children, I think it's important to remember that the actual order to pay compensation was only issued a few months ago. And as part of this process, and this is something that I and the Government of Canada are resolutely dedicated to, no child has had to testify, and we do not want any child to have to testify in court. This is a process that deals with an issue about compensation, and the issue of compensation as issued by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, we believe, does not respect basic principles of proportionality. It doesn't mean that there will not be just equitable compensation that will be issued. There are, as you know, Christy, 2 other class action cases ongoing. We have ongoing confidential discussions with partners to those class actions, and potentially any result of those negotiations could yield higher amounts for those who suffered the most harm. And I think it's important to remember when we talk about proportionality, there are legal principles, but there are also people behind that who did suffer historic harms. This is something that is immensely complex from a legal perspective, but the Minister of Justice and I have spent an immense amount of time going through documents to make sure that they are respectful of our relationship with Indigenous communities. And sadly, it has come to a review of a court case with respect to which there are disagreements too. It doesn't mean that we can't move at the same time along compensating children or moving along systemic reform. And I think it's important to remember that there is no single court case that can affect systemic change that we need to have in this country with respect to a broken childcare system that has been one that has been focused disproportionately on intervention as opposed to prevention. It is based in deep-rooted issues in and around colonialism, poverty, neglect. These are all deeply painful and profound issues that have characterized and scarred our country. We're moving along that path. It's not fast enough, but laws like C-92 that will reform and lift up the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples to take control and care over their own children, something that we take for granted, are transformative documents, but they do move slowly, and that's not right. It's why we keep investing significant historic sums of this government, more than any other government in history, to make sure we're fixing this system. But again, it's slow and often painful, and this today is one example of that. And we'll let the proceedings play out in court, but we'll make sure at all times that we're being respectful in our representations.
Thank you, ministers. This now concludes the press conference. Merci, ministre. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. Bonne journée.
Thank you. Merci. The conference has now ended. La conférence est maintenant terminée.